Alrighty, so we'll kind of go from the beginning. So this is your introduction to psychology course. One of the uniquenesses is the application of what psychology is and what it means. A lot of students have kind of proffered the outlook that one, within psychology, there are a slew of ideas of what they believe psychology is. Some believe it's along the lines of, predicting things and predicting someone's behavior. And then some believe that, once you go into psychology, you can read people's behavior and you learn everything about them in the first 5 minutes and everything else. But if you notice, psychology is a little more intricate than that. There's a little more, not so much mystery, but there's a little more work to it. So within that, Mr. Professor, Mr. Barber, within that, without further ado, we'll kind of go into chapter 1. So this is your textbook. Everybody should have a textbook. If you do not, I urge you to download the textbook. You're going to be using this a lot. You're going to be using this for a lot of your quizzes, for a lot of your informationals. When you write a lot of your discussion or answering a lot of your discussion questions, you're using a lot of some of the stuff from the textbook and stuff like that. So I would urge you to download this textbook. Moving forward. So what is psychology? And that's always a question a lot of people have. So what is psychology? A lot of times people, when you're probably telling your family and telling your loved ones and everything else, you're like, I'm studying psychology, or I have a class that deals in the area of psychology. There's a lot of individuals who look at psychology and think, oh no, you're going to analyze me. Again, there's a little bit of work with that. You do a lot of assessments, you do a lot of analyzing, you do a lot of different intricate work with that. But there's a little more to it. It's more of a science than I would say that it's a mixture. You have a mixture of a science and also an art. You have a lot of individuals who are highly educated, but lack the empathy and lack the rapport building and stuff like that. The human characteristics, which can limit your ability to assist people. And so that's one of the things you're always looking at too, is making sure that you're applying not only the scientific knowledge, but also applying a lot of the human qualities to it when you're helping individuals. So here you have the element of what is psychology. So again, when you look at psych, so again you have the soul. So this is going back years and years and years ago. So the psych was considered the soul, and then ology is the scientific study of. So then you mix both, and so initially you're looking at the scientific study of the soul, in other words, the mind. And so that's where we have the scientific study of the mind and behavior. So as we look at that, we're looking and saying, okay, how can I, as a psychologist or even a student of the mind, how can I understand people? And one of the biggest things is you're looking at basic behaviors. You're looking at things that everyday individuals do. Say for example, your habitual patterning. The way you conduct yourself, the way you conduct yourself in relationships, the way you communicate with your kids, the way you communicate with people around you, or the way you do things in total. So again, psychologists study everything about the human experience, from basic workings of the human brain to consciousness to memory, language, reasoning, personality, and mental health. So that's one of the things we kind of differentiate. We make sure that we understand. We're learning more about the human brain in terms of consciousness, in terms of memory, say for example, memory loss or formulation of memories. How does it come about? And then language. Language is one of those universal tools that we use. We have our Diné language. We have our, if you're of a different ethnicity, you have the language that you hold dear to you there. And so that's one of the things you kind of look at. You look at the interpretations, and we look at our reasoning and our personality. So reasoning is primarily how we conduct things, why we do the things that we do. And then we have our personality. Our personality is keen to each of us. So in other words, your personality is you as an individual. You like certain things and you don't know why, but you feel like, hey, this is a part of me. Then you have your mental health. Even during this time, it's one of those things where you're looking at mental health. You're looking at how you take care of yourself. You take care of, you try to make sure that you take the breaks, the necessary breaks that you need, even during stressful times. For me, I used to work with crisis, and I love working with crisis, but one of the biggest things you kind of come across is the element of burnout. And for a lot of individuals, one of the things I'm always looking at is making sure that, and that's what I always try to emphasize for a lot of my courses, is the element of understanding who you are. Because if you don't know the trauma that you've dealt with, or if you feel like, hey, I'm going to push this trauma aside, or if I've had some level of trauma in my life, and if I try to just squash it, and if I try to just push it aside, the element of, is this healthy? A lot of times the answer is no. And the reason why is when you try to push it aside, you try to ignore it, what happens is it affects you later on in life. It affects you throughout your everyday interactions. And when I talk to people, when I counsel people, that's one of the biggest things you're always looking at. You're looking at the elements of, have I dealt with this initial trauma, or have I dealt with this, that, and the other? And if I've never dealt with it, but it's there, bear in mind that what's going to happen is at later points in time, it's going to begin to arise. It's going to begin to come out in different ways. And so within that, that's one of the things you're looking at. You're looking at your mental health. You're looking at how, and I know I went on this whole other tangent, but that's kind of what you're looking at with psychology. You're looking at taking care of yourself before you can also help another person. And one of the biggest key elements that I always remember was it's kind of like a motto, where you look at the element of clinician or physician, heal thyself. So in order for you to help somebody else, you have to make sure that you yourself are good and solid, and you have a good solid base. Because if not, what's going to happen is when you're helping another individual and you don't have the healthy coping techniques, what's going to happen is it's going to affect you. And so that's one of the biggest things I'm always looking at, is making sure that when you're helping somebody, make sure that you yourself are in a good place as well. I've had individuals who went into the helping profession, or they went into the area of, various helping professions, whether it's nursing, whether it's psychology, whether it's being a clinician, all these different things. And they went in with the sole purpose of wanting to help others, but they never had dealt with various issues in their own lives. And so when they were working with a person, those issues began to arise. And what happened is you end up having what's called transference and countertransference, where you're presenting things subconsciously to the patient or the person that you're trying to help. And instead of the person that you're trying to help, instead of you trying to help that person that needs help, that person ends up having to try to take care of you. And so that's one of the things I'm always looking at, is making sure that when you go into the area of psychology, when you go into the area of social work, or when you go into the area of the helping profession, you want to make sure that you yourself have a good solid basis. So psychological perspectives, there's numerous. There's structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalytic theory, Gestalt psychology, behaviorism, humanism. So structuralism, you're looking at William Wundt, understanding the conscious experience through introspection. So in other words, you're looking inwards. You're looking at your conscious experience, so the things that you're happening every day, you're doing this, that, and the other, but you're also looking through the element of, why am I doing this, that, and the other? You're having that level of self-analyzation. Then you have functionalism. You have William James, who focused on how mental activities helped an organism adapt to its environment. One of the things that you kind of end up doing is, for example, if you live on the reservation, you do different activities to kind of keep you sane. But the mental activities that you end up doing, even as Tanekh, what do we do? Our traditionalism tells us, to wake up early, to meet Father, Son, stuff like that. And so one of the biggest things that we look at is, why do we do that? Well, if you look back in the history of who we are, we do a lot of these things because, one, it kept us healthy. Two, it connected us with a level of spiritualism, which then helped with our mental activities, which then helped us to adapt to our environment. And now you have psychoanalytic theory, which then focuses on the role of the unconscious in affecting conscious behavior. So this is where the unconscious kind of is where a lot of individuals kind of go to. I unconsciously did this, which then affected what I was doing when I was awake. And so that's one of the things you're always looking at is you have a lot of individuals who utilize Sigmund Freud, and this is where you have the individual, and we'll talk about that later on, but this is the individual who always had the Sigmund Freud couch, where a lot of individuals always kind of go to that mentality of, talk therapy, being under that initial control setting. And so within that's what they're looking at is, how does my unconscious affect my conscious behaviors? Is there something that I'm unconsciously thinking about or unconsciously is there, which then affected how my conscious bodily reactions? And then you have Gestalt psychology, which focuses on humans as a whole rather than individual parts. And for me, I'm more along this line. I look at, helping yourself as a whole, which then, and it's kind of like that holistic element, making sure that when you're well, mentally, physically, spiritually, you're able to function in a more positive manner. And if one part is affected, it affects other parts of your initial outlook. Then you have behaviorism, focusing on observing and controlling behavior. One of the biggest, not tools, but this was back when I was an undergrad in Albuquerque at UNM. One of the things I ended up doing, I had a good friend of mine. We both had the same class, and it was a psychology course. And when I first heard about behaviorism, I was kind of, very skeptical. You had Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner, but this focus was looking at observing and controlling behavior. And one of the things I always remember is I had a good friend of mine. Every day from the beginning of that course, when I first heard about behaviorism, I wanted to see if it works. So one of the things that I tried was every day I always had a stick of gum, and I would always offer that friend of mine a stick of gum. And I would kind of just see, stick of gum every class, every course, or every class that we had, every time. It was to the point where it became a repetitive behavior. And then at one point, that good friend of mine was, sticking out their hand like, okay. And I'm looking at them like, what do you want? And they're looking at me, and I guess they didn't even realize that they were doing it as well. It became such a normalized behavior, a habitual pattern, to where they became reliant on that stick of gum. And so you do things, small things like that, which then changes our initial outlooks. So again, that's one of the things you're looking at. A lot of times for alcoholism, you end up trying to change the behavior. You're observing the behavior, you're trying to change that habitual pattern. And then from humanism, emphasize the potential for good that is innate to all humans. So this is looking at Abraham Maslow and also Carl Rogers, which then looks at the potential for good. So again, it's looking at the outlook that every person is innately good, and so within that, we try to do things that are good and beneficial in our lives. So again, that's one of the things you kind of look at. So this is kind of the history of psychology in a nutshell. So here's Wilhelm Wundt. So again, this is structuralism. So again, he's credited as one of the founders of psychology. Created the first laboratory for psychological research. The focus was on structuralism itself, focus on understanding the structure and characteristics of the mind through introspection. So again, what is introspection? So again, it's a process by which someone examines their own conscious experience in an attempt to break it into its own component parts. So you're trying to break it down, trying to break down, why do I do this, that, and the other? And I always have individuals who always ask, what's the best way of looking at introspection? I said, all right. I said, one of the best things is, for example, when you break up with somebody. In your relationships, everything else a lot of times is pretty good. But then when you break up with somebody, it's a realization of what has happened. Why did this person break up with me? A lot of times you have that introspection. You start looking at your own behaviors. You're looking at your own conscious experiences. You're looking at this, that, and the other and trying to say, was it something I did? And for others, the introspection is not there. They look at it as, I am a gem to this world and I am perfect. Which, again, every person, whether or not they like it or not, there's always a level of improvement that can be made. But it's one of those things where this is the best example I can think of right now of introspection. So William James, again, this is functionalism. Again, the first American psychologist, again, drew from the functionality of cognitive processes. In other words, how our mind interprets things. Establishing functionalism, again, it emphasized how mental activities contributed to basic environmental survival. So we were looking at things from the element of, why do I do this, that, and the other? Well, initially to survive. We do a lot of our mental activities to survive. Individuals will subconsciously or even consciously make efforts to eat. Why? Why do we do that? Well, because one, it gives us a sense of satisfaction. Two, it fills a necessary need. Three, it provides us with sustenance so we're able to continue onwards in life. So therefore, that's the basic environmental survival, or that element of survival. So Sigmund Freud. So here's the Freud's couch. Again, the focus was on psychoanalytic theory. A lot of individuals have indicated that this is the father of psychology. That's one, not true. Number two, his focus was on the psychoanalytic theory, not on the overall encompassing elements of psychology, but more along the lines of psychoanalytic theory. So again, his focus was on studying hysteria and neuroses. Again, he theorized that many of his patients' problems arose from the unconscious mind. The belief that one, the unconscious mind, could be assessed through dream analysis. And this is where you have dream books on dreams and how we try to interpret dreams. Even to this day, it's still a mystery. It's still one of those uniquenesses where when we sleep, a lot of times we're trying to figure out, why do we have dreams? And I've had individuals try to question this, and they're like, what about me? I don't dream. I don't ever have a dream. And the reality is, even for people who believe I don't have a dream, they have dreams. It's just that their ability to remember it is not there. So again, this is where the rapid eye movement comes in and everything else, and that'll be covered later on in your book and everything else. But you're looking at the focus on the role of a person's unconscious and early childhood experiences. Again, this can also be attributed to, say, for example, even our everyday lives. A lot of times we'll have a dream and it conjures up something from our past. And a lot of times our dreams will kind of present things that have happened prior. And a lot of times people are like, but I had a dream about, this, that, and the other. And I always ask them, I said, well, did you eat before you went to sleep? And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I ate, I had a big lunch, or I had a big dinner, or, I had something right before I went to sleep, I ate something. And that's when I had this, that, and the other. And again, that can also affect how we have dreams. And also just our experiences. A lot of times we have our own experiences here and there, and that can impact our ability to remember things. But again, you're focusing on the unconscious through early childhood experiences. So here is Sigmund Freud. Again, here's an old text. So again, Sigmund Freud was a highly influential figure in the history of psychology. One of his many books shared his ideas about psychoanalytic therapy. Again, it was published in 1922. So here you have a lot of individuals who always focus in on the Freud couch. They always, whenever you hear somebody saying, oh yeah, I'm studying psychology, their main emphasis is always on the Freud couch. They're always like, you probably lay back and you just tell all your problems and everything else about your unconscious mind. But if you realize there's more to psychology than always focusing in on the unconscious mind. So, Gestalt psychology. So you have Kohler, Kafka, and Wertheimer were German psychologists who immigrated to the U.S. to escape Nazi Germany. So in other words, what is Gestalt? It's the whole. It's based on the idea that although a sensory experience can be broken down into individual parts, how those parts relate to each other as a whole is often what the individual responds to in perception. So ideas of Gestalt continue to influence research on sensation and perception. So again, you're breaking down things. You're trying to make sure that you understand you as a whole, but there are various key components that you're coming across. You have sensation. Sensation is based upon memory techniques. You're looking at things that have happened in your life, things that have impacted you, the smell of something, the sight of something, the noise of something, which then creates a sensation, which then can influence our perception, how we interpret things. For example, and I always use that. I used to be a teen dating violence prevention educator. So one of the things I always look at is when you have a breakup. I always use breakup as my main focal point, because a breakup's usually a major pinnacle in a relationship. So when you break up with somebody, what happens? The sensations, all this and that, kind of impacts you. But it's all based upon our perception. For example, we may have a sensory perception of the smell of someone's perfume or cologne. And when that smell hits us, it brings back not only memories, but also it affects even our day. It affects how we interpret our day. It affects how we interpret our existence in that moment in time. Sometimes it brings about disgust. Sometimes it brings about joy. Sometimes it brings about anger. All these different things, which then influences us. We hear a song. Maybe it was our favorite song that you and your former significant other used to listen to. And when you hear that song, suddenly it either brings back good memories, it impacts you, and within that, it changes your ability to perceive the world around you. You look at it, sometimes you look at it as, oh, it was a good memory, or, that was this, that, and the other, or, oh my gosh, it just brings back so much anger. So you're looking at that. You're looking at small pieces that kind of fit together, which then create the whole of an individual. So Pavlov, classical conditioning. So again, his focus was on reflexes in regards to animals. So again, you have conditioned reflexes in which an animal produced a reflex, in other words, the unconscious, which is responded to by a stimulus, in other words, salivating the presence of food, and over time was conditioned to produce the response to a different stimuli, salivating to the sound of a bell, that the experimenter associated with the original stimulus. So again, if you look at it, the reflex of the dog was to respond to the presence of a food by salivating. But as time progressed, what happens is the moment the bell is rung, not only is the dog has now substituted seeing the food with now just hearing the bell. And now when they hear that bell, associated with the fact that they may get a treat or they may get food, which then creates a change in response. So Watson, behaviorism. Again, John B. Watson is known as the father of behaviorism within psychology. He believed that objective analysis of the mind was impossible. Instead, he focused on observable behavior and ways to bring that behavior under control. Again, we utilize behaviorism in the area of cognitive psychology, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and also behavioral therapy. So B.F. Skinner. So first was Pavlov, which had classical conditioning. Now we have B.F. Skinner, who looks at operant conditioning. So again, his focus was on how behavior was affected by its consequence. So again, studied the principles of modifying behavior through reinforcement and punishment, which he saw as major factors in driving behavior. So again, you have A, and then you have B. B is the rat. The rat is looking at the speaker, the lights, the lever, and the dispenser. So again, he's famous for his research on operant conditioning. So B, you have a modified version of the operant conditioning chamber, or in other words, the Skinner box, which is still widely used in research settings today. So again, based upon hitting the lever, the rat may actually get a dispensement of food, and you start to change behavior and alter behavior based upon the punishment aspect or the reinforcement aspect. So here's Maslow. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So again, you have the various elements. You have self-actualization, esteem, social security, and physiological. So the first one is inner fulfillment. In other words, a lot of this comes down to relationships, an inner sense of self-satisfaction. And then you have esteem. In other words, your self-worth, accomplishments, your confidence boosts. And then you have the social elements of family, friendship, and intimacy and belonging. Then you have security, safety, employment, assets. And then the highest is the food, water, shelter, and warmth. Again, the proposed hierarchy of human needs and motivating behavior. So Maslow asserted that so long as basic needs are met, in other words, food, water, and shelter, the higher level needs would begin to motivate behavior. So if you have food, water, shelter, and warmth all together, you're able to move farther and farther up the line. But if you don't have food, water, and shelter in line, it can impact your ability to motivate behavior. It can impact your ability to respond. And so that's one of the things. You have individuals going about today who are trying to get the physiological under control. And I used to see this a lot when I used to work with elementary schools. So if you have a kid whose basic needs are not met, their ability to really focus in on education is not really there. Their ability to make friendships is not really there. Their ability to feel a level of safety is not really there. Because in order for safety to happen, the other major needs had to be met. And so this impacts their ability to feel safe in a unique environment. So again, this is kind of how it breaks down. So Carl Rogers, humanism, again developed the client-centered therapy method that has been influential in clinical methods. So client-centered meaning that you're focused in on the client itself. You're focused in on making sure that the patient takes a lead role in the therapy session. He believes that unconditional positive regard as well as genuineness and empathy kind of play out in regards to your therapeutic efforts. And within that, that's one of the things that I always try to apply. I use more of a client-centered approach when I would do counseling. And you're looking at the elements of making sure that Maslow's hierarchy of needs are met. But in addition to that, you're also making sure that when you're responding to an individual, you're being positive in that unconditional element, but also being genuine and also have a level of empathy. You're trying to see where the person is coming from. You're trying to see what's happening. You're trying to see what issues that they're suffering with. And so within that, that's where you're kind of coming across with and sharing your insights and sharing what can be proffered and what can be applied. So the cognitive revolution, Noam Chomsky. So by the 1950s, new disciplinary perspectives in linguistics, neuroscience, and computer science were emerging. So again, the mind became the new focus of scientific inquiry. So again, with Noam Chomsky, he was very influential in beginning the cognitive revolution. He believed psychology needed to incorporate mental functioning into its focus in order to fully understand human behavior. So again, you have a photo right there, a mural honoring Noam Chomsky. This is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So the branches of psychology, you have various branches. You have numerous branches. Biopsychology and evolutionary psychology, sensation and perception, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, personality psychology, social psychology, health psychology, IO psychology, sports and exercise psychology, clinical psychology, and forensic psychology. My area is mostly in the area of clinical psychology and forensic psychology, with a mix of cognitive psychology and some levels of industrial and organizational psychology. So what is biopsychology? Again, you're studying the structure and function of the nervous system, which generate behavior. So again, research focuses on sensory and motor systems, sleep, drug use and abuse. Again, if you take various drugs, it can impact your ability to function. If you take antipsychotics, it can impact your ability to function. And so again, that's what you're looking at. You have ingestive behavior, you have reproductive behavior. Reproductive behavior meaning that your ability to procreate and your ability to have lineage and everything else kind of plays in. Then also neurodevelopment, your ability to grow in terms of your brain development. And this is more of the structure system, not so much the mind and behavior. Then you have the plasticity of the nervous system, the ability to reroute. Say, for example, if you get an injury, a lot of times your body will try to reroute it so that it allows you to continue functioning. And then you have biological correlates of psychological disorders. A lot of times you have different disorders that are played out based upon your biological input. Various triggers can arise, which then impact your ability to cope, which then impact your ability to be mentally healthy. So all these kind of contribute in regards to biopsychology. So sensation and perception. Now, this area of study focuses on both physiological aspects of sensory systems and the psychological experience. In other words, sensations meaning sensory information. So you have sight, sound, touch, and smell. Then perceptions, experience of the world, which is influenced by where we focus our attention, our previous experiences, and our cultural background. So if you look at figure 1.12, A, 1, it looks like a rabbit. 2, it also looks like a duck. When you look at the image, you may see a duck or a rabbit. The sensory information remains the same, but your perception can vary dramatically. In the picture on the right, 1.12b, some have noted an individual, a young girl looking to her right, with a feather in her hair and wearing a fur coat, with a big old giant, I don't know what you would call that, veil over her hair. And then some have also looked at this as an old grandma. An old grandma, you can see the nose, the eyelashes, and, kind of a sunken in look, and the hair kind of has that scarf. And so that's kind of your perception, your sensations based upon what your sights see play into your experiences, your previous experiences. And that's where you're kind of looking at and saying, okay, is this an old grandma or a young individual, or is this a duck, or is it a rabbit? So cognitive psychology. Branch of psychology that focuses on cognition and thoughts and their relationship to our experiences and our actions. In other words, attention. How's our attention span? Problem-solving skills. Is our ability to problem-solve evident? And then language. Are we able to move around with different languages? Are we able to implement different languages? And then memory. How does our ability to remember things change, and does it vary? And the reality is yes, it does vary at times. And so that's kind of the uniquenesses that kind of play into cognitive psychology. So here you have developmental psychology, which studies the physical and mental attributes of aging and maturation. Again, this can include various skills that are acquired throughout growth, moral reasoning, cognitive skills, social skills. Again, you see a lot of Jean Piaget's work in regards to development, in regards from infancy all the way into adulthood, into the area of even just geriatric care, or even into death itself. When I teach developmental psychology, our human growth and development, human growth and development, or even when I teach on adolescence and adulthood, a lot of times you're taking a lot of work from Jean Piaget and his work in regards to how we interpret various moral reasonings based upon age, cognitive skills, where an individual should be at in regards to their maturation, and also their social skills in terms of their interpretation of the world around them and other people around them as well. So again, this is developmental psychology. So personality psychology looks at various traits. So you have the low score and you have the high score. So again, this is a 5-factor model. The best way to remember this is through OCEAN. So you have O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. In other words, tendency toward unstable emotions. Again, you're looking at the low end all the way into the high end, and you're kind of taking those things into account in regards to behaviors and thought patterns that each individual has. So again, you're taking these various distinctions into consideration. And when I teach on human sexuality, we kind of take these various elements also into consideration when we're working with other people across the board. When you're working with individuals who have level of argumentative features and stuff like that, you're kind of trying to help them in various uniquenesses when you're counseling and stuff like that. So that's where you kind of take the personality psychology into consideration. And then you have social psychology. This is where Stanley Milgram's work kind of came into light in regards to various controversies, in regards to ethicalities. So this is where you have prejudice, attractions, interpersonal conflicts, and obedience. So if you have a chance, look up Stanley Milgram's. In the next slide, I'll kind of go over kind of the Stanley Milgram study. So hopefully it'll kind of clarify what I mean by obedience. So here you have Stanley Milgram's controversial work. So one of the focus was on the experimenter, volunteer, and the shockee. So again, the focus was on, and again, the newspaper ad that you saw prior or previously, that it kind of just notes volunteers. But one of the things was the volunteer was told he would be participating in an experiment testing the effects of negative reinforcement, in other words, punishment on learning. The volunteer was told that a teacher giving electrical shocks and learner receiving electrical shocks were to be picked at random. So this one kind of came into the area of controversy because of the ethicality. So you had one individual who was getting shocked. Again, it was they would pretend to be in pain. But it gets higher and higher to the point where the individual was willing to go above and beyond and farther in terms of obedience. That's the reason why the question of, why did individuals in Nazi Germany, you always use that as an example, why did individuals in Nazi Germany, follow commands blindly? And the reality is, within the element of obedience, we tend to have that element of superiority to the point where we begin to have a level of oversight, but also control. And so as time progresses, we begin to separate ourselves in that we fall back on the element of, well, this individual told me to do it, and that's the reason why I did it. And so that's where the Stanley Milgram obedience feature has a lot of controversy, and that's the reason why the ethicalities or the ethics kind of play into this. So again, even though it was a fake study, or not fake study, but it was a fake. There was a fake test subject and everything else. It still played on the person who was the experimenter. So that's one of the things is. Or not the experimenter, but the shockee. And so again, as time progressed, it tend to change. It tend to alter the mindset of the individual and begin to have an adverse effect. So. And moving forward. So here's a thoroughly modern version of Milgram's test. So you have the experimenter, the volunteer, and the shock individual who's applying the shock. Again, this was more of a tone now. You're using feelings probed using neural readings or volunteer's sense of time lag between key being pressed and a tone sounding. So again, that's kind of like a modification of what was used prior. Prior was the shock, but now this one's kind of looking more at the tone and everything else. So you see how there is a certain level of ethicality or a certain level of applied ethics in this one, so that you're not psychologically hurting an individual. And so that's where you kind of took into account of that. So here you have health psychology, another branch, which kind of looks at the overall wellness of an individual in terms of combating illnesses and looking at your health. So you have biological, psychological, and social. All of these kind of intertwine. So you have the biological sense, which is your body, the social sense, which is the everyday interactions or just interactions in general with other people. And then you have the psychological, your interpretation. And each one kind of just plays off one another. And if one is impacted, it impacts the other, which can impact your health, which can lead to illness, and which can lead to various detriments in your health overall. So again, this is primarily, in a nutshell, kind of outlook of health psychology. Then you have clinical psychology, which is where kind of a lot of times we're trying to, or primarily when I teach a lot of these courses, I'm looking at those elements. For clinical psychology, you're looking at diagnosing, treating, and getting a level of control over problematic behavior or patterns of behavior. So again, the focus is clinical psychology is the implementation of clinical therapy and counseling. So again, there's a mixture. Cognitive behavioral therapists take cognitive processes and behaviors into account. This is one of several strategies that may be used in practicing clinical psychologists. So if you look at, you have the thoughts, which are impacted by the emotions, which can impact behavior, or your behavior is impacted by your thoughts, which is impacted by your emotions, or your emotions are impacted by your thoughts, which is a result of the behaviors. So again, each one kind of weighs in on one or the other and takes into account that level of a triad. So each one kind of plays a distinct part in your mental well-being and also your mental health. Then you have IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology, which takes into account the workplace. A lot of times you have individuals who work in the workplace who are psychologists and who offer helpful strategies to either have a positive work environment or even just having that element of creating unique dialogue. For example, Christmas time, what do we see? We see a lot of, there's a play on senses or sensory perceptions. For example, during Christmas time, what do we smell a lot of? We smell a lot of homemade cookies, and when we go to the mall or anywhere else, there's that play. There's a play on our sensory perception. There's the smell of pine needles, there's the smell of this, that, and the other. And then also we have the comfort food, and all these things play in. And if you go to various, during Christmas time, if you go to the mall or you go to various locations, we see all of these things, which then, through our perception of what we initially interpret with Christmas, we begin to either shop more or we begin to just pick up various items. And that's the reason why, like, say, for example, if you go to Walmart or if you go to Bashas', you have all the goodie items, the small items, right at the checkout stand. And the reason why is a lot of times they know that that's a time when you're standing there in line for a while and they want you to grab. They want you to grab, and they play on those emotions. A lot of times it's mostly sweets. Because you're kind of looking at like, all right, I went through the whole store and now I'm checking out, and now I'm seeing a reduction in my energy level because I ran in, did my shopping, and now I need a boost. And therefore you have the good items right there. And also the layout. If you go to Safeway and all these other locations, you see a layout. There's a layout that's based on health items. If you notice, where are all the good items? A lot of the good items, and good items, what I mean is the fast foods, not fast food, but more the junk food. It's kind of located more closer to the checkout aisle. Versus if you see the healthier foods, they're farther away, they're farther in the back, and you're having to make a farther trip. Again, that plays on our perception, that plays on how a psychologist has laid out the room based upon our needs, based upon our desires. And then you have sports psychology, sports and exercise. This can be impacted by motivation. Say, for example, if there's a sports injury, it impacts our mental health because an individual may feel like, hey, I'm out of the season, and how can I get back and everything else. So sports psychologists kind of take into account all of that. And they also try to motivate. They try to encourage and everything else. A lot of sports psychologists will work in the field. A lot of them work as health coaches to help individuals get motivated to continue with workout and stuff like that. And the last one is forensic psychology. The emphasis of the law and psychology. A lot of times you're taking into account the justice system. And this is kind of where I take on that feature because I have a master's in forensic psychology. So a lot of times you're looking at the legal practicalities. You're looking at the legal ramifications, jury selections, perception of a victim when working with a perpetrator, and vice versa. How inmates may interpret correctional officers, and how families may interpret custody battles and stuff like that. So again, that's forensic psychology in a nutshell. There's more to it. There's more to the forensic psychology, but for the sake of this slide, we kind of just briefly go into the various subtleties within psychology itself. And then careers. A lot of times you have the PhD in the PsyD program. For me, I'm currently working on my dissertation, so it's for a doctorate in psychology, so it's going to be a PsyD. A lot of times you're looking at career development and career improvement. And a lot of times you're trying to look at how can I apply my understanding of psychology. You have different fields. You have teaching, you have research, clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, social work, corporate and marketing, as well as various jobs here and there. So again, these are various careers in psychology. Careers in psychology is very blendable. It has a lot of plasticity, so it can be applied in various settings. So employment in different sectors. So here's a rundown of different employments in different sectors back in 2009. So this was collected in 2011. So this is kind of just a collection of information from then. Again, one of the things you're finding is that psychology kind of just has an inner blended feature overall. So if there's any questions, feel free to let me know. So this one kind of just covers chapter 1. We're moving on to chapter 2. So have an awesome day. How går det?